fire lit up the midnight sky. Flames tearing through the Whitfield mansion as 12-year-old Evelyn Carter stood in the garden watching in silence while the master's children screamed from their beds. Those cries would echo through Charleston for generations, a night of horror seared into memory. By morning, the girl who sparked the blaze was gone, vanishing into the swamps and leaving only barefoot tracks and whispers of vengeance that no one dared repeat. What could drive a child to such an act, and how did she disappear without a trace? In 1839, Charleston, South Carolina sweltered under a strange heat that pressed down on the city and its grand plantation estates lining the Ashley River. Among them rose the Whitfield plantation, a towering 3-story home with gleaming white columns and gardens filled with magnolia and jasmine. But behind that beauty lay the cruelty of bondage, and it was here that Evelyn, barely 12, came to understand hatred. Born into slavery, she was the daughter of Sarah Carter, the head cook, and an unnamed father. When her mother died at just 8 years old, Evelyn was left alone to navigate the merciless world of the Whitfield household. She worked inside the mansion, small and quiet enough to move unnoticed. Her hands put to delicate tasks that kept her always within reach of the family's scorn. The master, Jonathan Whitfield, had inherited both the estate and a profitable shipping business, living in luxury with his wife Catherine and their 3 children, 10-year-old Margaret, 8-year-old Robert, and little William, barely 5. To Charleston's elite, the Whitfields looked like a model family, faithful churchgoers who hosted elegant dinners for the city's powerful. But inside their home, cruelty was routine. Jonathan was harsh and unyielding, Catherine cold and complicit, and their children raised in that atmosphere learned early to treat the enslaved as less than human. Evelyn's daily duty was to fan the children during their meals, standing silently with a palmetto fan in hand while her arms ached from endless motion. They spoke around her as though she didn't exist. Once little William asked why Evelyn's skin was always so dirty. Without looking up from his plate, Jonathan answered that God had made her people that way, fit only for labor in the sun. Margaret, the eldest, delighted in tormenting Evelyn. She spilled water just to make her clean. It pinched her arms until they bruised and accused her of laziness if she faltered. Catherine would glance up with her cold eyes and threaten to send Evelyn to the punishment room, a dark space beneath the kitchen stairs where slaves were locked away with nothing but bread and water. Evelyn knew that room too well. Each time she sat in the darkness, her mind raced with thoughts of escape, revenge, or the faint hope that someone might one day care about her suffering. And as the months passed, she began to notice details, small things the Whitfields never thought she could understand. Late at night, Evelyn began piecing together truths the Whitfields never thought she noticed. She heard Jonathan's bitter complaints about money, how his shipping business was faltering, and how selling off slaves might be the only way to keep himself afloat. She watched Catherine slip laudanum into her tea, numbing her dissatisfaction with the opium-laced drink. And most of all, Evelyn memorized the rhythm of the house. The hours when the Whitfields slept, the doors that stayed unlocked, the quiet pockets of darkness where no one paid attention. The other enslaved people treated her carefully, a mix of sympathy and distance. Being in the master's house meant she overheard things that could be dangerous, and her age made the elders want to protect her, even as they knew to keep their own secrets close. Old Moses, the stable hand, was the only one who ever spoke plainly. One evening, as they fed the horses together, he told her child, "I see the fire in your eyes. That fire gets our kind killed." Evelyn whispered back, "I'd rather die than live like this forever." Moses gripped her shoulder, his hand worn and strong. "Don't talk like that. Death ain't freedom. Death is nothing. If you want out, you wait for the right time. You be smart." But waiting no longer satisfied her. Each day carved new scars into her spirit, each humiliation feeding a dangerous determination. She studied the lamps as they were filled with oil, the long curtains that brushed against the parlor fireplace, the windows that opened easily to the night air. The final spark came on a stifling July night when the Whitfields hosted one of their elaborate dinners. Evelyn stood silently behind the children palmetto fan in hand as the grown-ups discussed the Nat Turner uprising in Virginia. Jonathan raised his wine glass and said hanging was too good for them. They should have made an example of every last one. A woman at the table shivered, saying, "They killed women and children. What kind of people could do that?" Catherine gave a brittle laugh. "You forget, my dear, they're not people, they're animals. Animals don't know right from wrong. That's why they need us." Margaret, sharp-eyed and cruel even at 10, turned to Evelyn. "Papa, do you think Evelyn would try to kill us in our sleep if she could?" The room fell into silence, every gaze pressing down on the small girl with the fan. Jonathan leaned forward, testing her. "Well, Evelyn, would you harm your master's family if you had the chance?" Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. She knew any answer would betray her. No would be dismissed as a lie. Yes would bring punishment. So she said nothing. She fanned steadily, face blank. Jonathan smirked. "See? She doesn't even understand the question. They're incapable of higher thought." But Evelyn understood. She understood better than they could imagine. In that moment, with laughter and cruelty still echoing around her, she knew she would never be seen as human in their eyes. That night, she made her choice. After the guests left and the house grew quiet, she performed her usual chores, clearing dishes, sweeping the dining room, snuffing out most of the lamps. But instead of slipping off to her small quarters behind the kitchen, Evelyn tucked herself into the shadows of the pantry and waited. Midnight drew near, the silence broken only by Jonathan's heavy snores upstairs and the creak of old floorboards settling in the night. And in that silence, Evelyn Carter prepared to change everything. Evelyn stayed hidden until she was sure the house had sunk into the deep silence of sleep. Then she crept from the pantry and padded softly into the parlor, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wood. The room was cloaked in shadows, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth and the faint glow of an oil lamp left burning on a side table. Her eyes, sharpened by hours of waiting in darkness, traced the tall velvet curtains, the polished furniture Jonathan prized, and the fragile flame that would become her weapon. For the briefest moment, she faltered. Old Moses's warning whispered in her ear. She thought of the other slaves who would surely suffer once the fire was discovered, and of the small chance she might flee Charleston and find freedom instead of vengeance. But then Margaret's pinches, Catherine's icy stares, and Jonathan's mocking voice filled her mind. They had never seen her as a child, only as property, a creature to be controlled. Her hesitation hardened into resolve. With hands steady beyond her years, Evelyn lifted the lamp and pressed its flame to the curtain's hem. The fabric smoldered, then flared, fire racing upward, in greedy bursts of orange and yellow. It spread quickly, licking across the fine furniture and crawling toward the ceiling. For a moment, she was spellbound by the beauty of it, the living, growing hunger of the flames. Then, remembering her window of escape was short, she placed the empty lamp on the floor, turned to the front door, and worked the lock she had long ago learned to open. The night air hit her face, warm and thick with summer, carrying the faint smoke that already leaked from the house. Instead of fleeing into the marsh, she drifted to the garden where Catherine's roses grew, sitting on the cold stone bench where she had so often been left in punishment. From there, she watched the fire bloom. At first it was a flicker against the parlor windows, but within minutes, the whole lower floor was swallowed in flames. They climbed fast, reaching the second story, and then the screams began. Margaret's shrill panic came first sharp and frantic. Robert's cries followed, desperate and confused, and then William's small voice sobbed for his parents. Jonathan's thunderous shouts tried to cut through the chaos, ordering, commanding. But the fire had already eaten away the staircase, sealing them above. Catherine's voice rang out too, not the loudest, but the most broken disbelief curdling into horror as she realized wealth and status meant nothing against fire. Evelyn sat motionless, blending into the garden's shadows, her expression unreadable. She felt no glee, no satisfaction, only a hollow stillness settling deep inside her, as if the blaze consumed something within her as well as the mansion. When the roof finally gave way, in a roar of collapsing timber sparks spiraling into the sky, the screams ceased. Evelyn neither knew nor cared whether death or escape had silenced them. Her part was finished. Rising from the bench, she walked slowly toward the marsh at the edge of the property, where manicured gardens dissolved into the wild wetlands stretching to the Ashley River. At the edge of the swamp, she stopped and looked back once more. Behind her, the world she had known for all of her 12 years collapsed into fire ashes and silence. Ahead lay only uncertainty, but also freedom. The Whitfield mansion blazed like a funeral pyre. Its once proud columns blackened and crumbling, its grand rooms turned to ash and memory. Evelyn had not just destroyed a house. She had struck at the illusion of permanence, shattering a world built on cruelty and chains. That truth should have terrified her, but instead she felt calm. For the first time in her short life, she had chosen her own fate. Whatever awaited her now would be hers alone, not dictated by masters who dismissed her as less than human. She slipped off the rough shoes that marked her enslavement and stepped barefoot into the warm mud of the marsh. The night creatures seemed to rise up around her, the croak of frogs, the whir of insects, the splash of unseen animals moving through the reeds, welcoming her into their secret kingdom. Guided by nothing but instinct, Evelyn waded deeper into the swamp, her steps slow but certain. Behind her, the fire roared upward like a second dawn, but she never turned to look again. By morning, word of the inferno had spread across Charleston. Curious crowds gathered at the ruins, their whispers carrying a mix of shock and fear. The mansion had burned so hot and fast that little remained but a skeletal frame and the smoldering wreckage of one of the city's proudest estates. When the search parties sifted through the ruins, they found the bodies of Jonathan, Catherine, Margaret, Robert, and little William. Smoke had claimed them before they could escape, ending the Whitfield line in a single night. For Charleston's white elite, the tragedy was unthinkable. Their wealth and status had always felt like armor, and the idea that fire and perhaps rebellion could pierce it shook them to the core. But the most unsettling discovery was the absence of Evelyn Carter. Her bed in the slave quarters was untouched, and none of the others could say where she had gone. Investigators found the burned-out lamp in the parlor, placed in a way that suggested intent, and a trail of barefoot prints that led into the marsh before vanishing into the endless tangle of waterways. Questioned under threat, the other slaves insisted they knew nothing of her plan or escape. Old Moses, steady under pressure, told the investigators only that the girl had been troubled, but gave no sign of plotting destruction. She was just a child, he said flatly, his tone revealing nothing. Scared of her own shadow most days. I can't imagine her doing such a thing. But inside, Moses was not surprised. He had seen that fire in her eyes, the same spark that once lived in him before the weight of years and chains smothered it. Evelyn Carter had carried it further than he ever could, into the night, into the fire, and into legend. Moses understood the fire in Evelyn's soul, even if he could never endorse the path she chose. Her act was born of desperation, not madness, and while he pitied the child she had been, he also knew she would never be forgotten. The hunt for Evelyn was relentless. Dogs from neighboring plantations were brought to sniff out her trail, and handbills plastered the city painting her as both runaway and murderer. Rewards were offered, warnings shouted, and Charleston buzzed with fear that a 12-year-old girl could destroy a dynasty and then vanish without a trace. Yet no one ever caught her. Some insisted she had drowned in the marshes, her small body carried off by the tides, her bones left for the alligators. Others swore she had been spirited away by abolitionists hidden among free black families who risked everything to shepherd fugitives north. And there were always whispers sightings of a young figure moving through the marsh at dawn or dusk, gliding just beyond reach, as though the swamp itself had claimed her as its own. The truth was, Evelyn had survived, though survival demanded more of her than anything she had endured at Whitfield Plantation. The swamp became her teacher. She learned to snatch fish with her hands, to recognize which roots would nourish and which would poison, to weave branches into shelters strong enough to withstand coastal storms. She made choices for the first time in her life, where to sleep, what to eat, when to move, each decision, shaping her into something stronger, sharper, freer. The silence was the hardest lesson. After years surrounded by the constant noise of others, even in cruelty, the marsh's vast solitude often pressed heavy on her. But over time, she began to find comfort in it, the hum of insects, the croak of frogs, the stillness of moonlit water. For the first time, her thoughts belonged only to herself. She was not, however, alone forever. Hidden deep within the wilderness were settlements of maroons escaped slaves who had carved out secret lives in places slave catchers feared to tread. They built camps in the most inaccessible thickets, surviving together on what they could hunt, fish, or steal, creating fragile but defiant communities. Evelyn found her way to one nearly 3 months after the fire, stumbling into a fishing camp on a cattail-ringed island. Suspicion met her first. She was young, she was alone, and her story was almost too much to believe. But rumors traveled fast, even in the swamps, and soon whispers of the Whitfield blaze and the vanished girl reached the campfires. When they realized who she was, the community split. Some recoiled, appalled by the thought of children perishing in the fire. Others looked at her with awe, believing she had done what none of them dared, striking terror at the very heart of their oppressors. For weeks, the arguments raged. Families quarreled, old wounds reopened, and the question of Evelyn's place threatened to divide the camp. In the end, it was Ruth, the oldest among them, who silenced the debate. A woman who had endured 20 years in the swamps after escaping Savannah, who had outlasted hunter's disease and hunger. Around the fire, she spoke, her voice low but steady. This child did what she thought she had to do. I won't judge her, and neither should any of you. We all got blood on our hands one way or another. And with that, the matter was settled. Evelyn Carter was one of them now. A fugitive, a survivor, and whether damned or celebrated, a symbol that the fire of resistance could live even in the smallest, quietest hands. Even if it's just our own from the whippings we took, she's here now. She's one of us, and that's all that matters. With Ruth's words, Evelyn was folded into the maroon community. Though she was never quite like the rest, she learned their ways quickly, proving herself useful as a scout and messenger. Her small frame and natural stealth allowed her to slip through the marshlands without being seen, carrying news between scattered camps or watching the movements of slave catchers from the shadows. The domestic skills she had once been forced to use in the Whitfield mansion, cooking, sewing, mending, also found value among the mostly male maroons. Yet Evelyn never settled fully into the life of the camp. The fire that had consumed the Whitfields never left her. It made her restless, haunted, and unpredictable. She often vanished for days, sometimes weeks, returning with scraps of news or warnings of patrols, but never saying where she had been or what she had done. The maroons came to accept her silences, giving her space when the dark moods settled on her, and welcoming her back when she reappeared. They understood she was scarred in ways that might never heal. As time passed, her story began to ripple beyond the swamps. In the quarters of nearby plantations, whispers spread of the girl who had burned her master's house with his family inside. In some versions, she was an avenger who struck terror into cruel owners. In others, she was held up as a grim warning of what happened when slaves stepped outside the roles forced upon them. But in every telling, she became a symbol that even a child could fight back, that resistance was possible. The tales unsettled Charleston's white community. Rewards for her capture grew larger each year, and seasoned slave catchers took pride in boasting they would be the ones to bring her in. But Evelyn was always one step ahead. By her 20s, she had become more legend than flesh in the eyes of many. Slaves whispered that she could cross water without leaving ripples vanish into air if threatened, or call on the spirits of the swamp to cloak her from danger. Some whites, too, began to believe the supernatural explained her survival. The truth was grittier, but no less remarkable. Evelyn had sharpened her skills through years of hardship, learning the marshes as if they were part of her own body. She knew every current and hidden channel, could read storms on the horizon, and live for weeks on what she trapped or foraged. She studied her hunters as carefully as they studied her, predicting their sweeps, avoiding their dogs, and hiding in places so miserable no one would think to search them. Most of all, she leaned into the fear others held of her. She let the myths grow, used them to shield herself, to keep enemies at bay, and sometimes even to distance herself from potential friends. The isolation was bitter, but it kept her free. When the Civil War came, the marshes trembled with new turmoil. Union soldiers moved along the South Carolina coast, recruiting freedmen and fugitives alike to fight against their former masters. Many Maroons joined, seeing in blue uniforms a chance to turn their defiance into organized battle. Evelyn, however, refused. Union recruiters sought her more than once, but she always turned them away. She had waged her own war, already burned her own battlefield to the ground, and she wanted no part in another. She had chosen her path long ago, and she would walk it alone. The freedom Evelyn had carved out for herself in the marshes was sacred, and she refused to surrender it to another chain of command, even one wrapped in promises of liberty. While other Maroons enlisted with Union troops, she stayed in the swamps, using the chaos of war to stretch her range farther than ever before. With Confederate patrols stretched thin and many plantations abandoned or left half-guarded, Evelyn slipped into territories once too dangerous to cross. She mapped creeks, hidden channels, and islands, extending her knowledge from the Santee River in the north down to the Savannah border in the south. It was during one of these journeys that she stumbled on something that unsettled her more deeply than any brush with hunters. On a lonely island in the middle of the Kahee River, Evelyn found the skeletal remains of a plantation house destroyed by Union fire. At first, the sight jolted her back in time, the charred beams and blackened stone conjuring memories of the Whitfield mansion in flames. For a moment, she was 12 again, standing in the garden listening to screams as the roof collapsed. But as she studied the ruins more closely, she realized this was not the same kind of fire. The Union soldiers had burned the house to cripple the plantation, not to slaughter its people. The family had escaped. Their lives, even the children's, had been spared. The realization struck Evelyn with a force she was unprepared for. She had always justified the Whitfield children's deaths by telling herself they were not innocent, that they had been raised in cruelty, trained to believe she was less than human, and would one day grow into the same kind of masters as their parents. But here was proof that fire could be used without blood destruction carried out, without children's screams echoing through the night. For months, she spiraled under the weight of that truth, Sleep came only in fragments, broken by dreams of Margaret's shrill panic and little William's cries for his mother. Food lost its taste. Hunger gnawed at her, but she could not force herself to eat. Guilt pressed down heavier than any chain she had ever worn. In her search for relief, Evelyn began to gather scraps of information about other slave uprisings, listening for stories of resistance. She wanted to know whether others had spilled blood the way she had, whether killing children had ever been part of the struggle. What she found was a bitter comfort. Rebellions had flared again and again across the South, some large, some small. Most crushed, but very few had turned their fury on children. Even Nat Turner's rebellion, demonized by white planters as savage and indiscriminate, had focused its violence largely on adult men, those who held the power of the whip and the chain. That knowledge carved at her like a blade. It forced her to see that her act had not been driven solely by resistance, but by rage, raw and personal. She had wanted revenge, and she had taken it without mercy. The thought was almost unbearable. If true, it meant she had become exactly what her masters always claimed enslaved people were: savage, monstrous, incapable of reason. It meant that in striking at the system that dehumanized her, she might have surrendered the very thing she had been fighting for: her own humanity. Evelyn's reckoning with herself lasted more than a year. She pulled away from everyone, withdrawing even deeper into the marsh until she seemed more ghost than woman. She spoke to no one, trusted no one, and toyed with the idea that perhaps the world would be better if she simply vanished. The swamp that had once given her freedom began to feel like a cage, and death sometimes seemed like the only release from her isolation and guilt. Yet slowly, through reflection and the grinding weight of time, she began to carve out another path. She could never undo what she had done, could never silence the screams that haunted her nights, but she could choose what came next. Instead of living for vengeance, she decided to live for others. She began to reach out cautiously to other fugitives and maroons, offering her unmatched knowledge of the waterways to help them escape to Union lines. In this, Evelyn found purpose. She became a guide of sorts for the Underground Railroad, though her routes wound through swamps and creeks instead of city safe houses. By her own count, she helped more than 200 enslaved men, women, and children flee bondage during the war years. Entire families found freedom because of her. The work was perilous, requiring trust in strangers and constant risk of discovery, but it was also her redemption. One rescue tested her more than all the others. A group of children sold away from their parents had been left behind on a coastal plantation. The youngest was only 6 years old, no older than William Whitfield had been when the fire consumed him. Guiding them through the marsh, coaxing their tired legs forward, keeping their sobs muffled as slave catchers prowled nearby, Evelyn was forced to confront the part of herself that had once chosen destruction over mercy. When she finally delivered them to Union lines after 3 grueling days, the oldest, a 10-year-old girl, looked up at her with wide eyes and asked in a trembling whisper, "Are you an angel?" Mama said, "Angels can look like regular people when they come to help." Evelyn could not answer. But in that moment, she knew she was something better than the child who had set fire to Whitfield's house. The guilt never left her, but she had found a way to live with it. When the war ended and slavery was abolished, Evelyn's world shifted again. Maroons left their hidden camps to build new lives, to seek family education and work in a South remade by law, if not by spirit. They urged her to come with them to lay down the swamp life and embrace the promise of freedom. But Evelyn could not. The skills that had saved her meant little in towns and cities, and the thought of living shoulder to shoulder with crowds filled her with unease. More than that, she could not shake the feeling that she did not deserve the freedom others had earned. Her liberty had been born in fire and children's screams, and she felt bound to the marsh as both penance and refuge. So she stayed. Over time, she became a legend, a name spoken in low tones among those who remembered. Some said she had turned into part of the swamp itself, an eternal guardian of its secrets. Occasionally, old friends from maroon camps would visit, bringing news and urging her to join the wider world. But she always declined, saying she had found her place and would remain. From the wilderness, she watched as Reconstruction's promises crumbled. She saw the rise of sharecropping, a new bondage in disguise. She heard whispers of the Ku Klux Klan terror spreading like rot through the night. She witnessed rights granted in blood and hope stripped away, piece by piece. Evelyn Carter remained where the law could not reach her, neither free nor enslaved, caught between myth and memory. A child of fire who had become a woman of shadows, she lived on in the marsh as a witness to both the destruction she had caused and the broken promises of a nation that called itself free. The cruelest truth Evelyn carried into old age was that the 3 children she had killed had died for nothing. Their deaths had not shattered the system that bound her people. White supremacy had endured reshaping itself after the Civil War into sharecropping, segregation, and terror cloaked in hoods. The Whitfield children were gone, but the world remained as merciless as ever. That knowledge could have crushed her, but instead it steeled her resolve. If her past could not be undone, then her future would be dedicated to something better. In the decades that followed, Evelyn devoted herself to helping those who stumbled into the marshes, fugitives, wanderers, and the desperate. She became a protector and a guide, offering shelter and safety to anyone who needed it. Word spread in certain circles that there was a woman in the swamps who could be trusted beyond all doubt, a woman who would never betray a soul seeking freedom. Over time, her reputation reached outsiders, scholars, and historians, eager to record first-hand accounts of slavery and resistance. Many tried to interview her, especially about the fire that had made her infamous, but she refused them all. She would not let strangers turn her story into spectacle. Instead, she told her truth in private to the young people who reminded her of herself at 12. She spoke not to glorify what she had done, but to warn them of the cost of anger unrestrained. There's always another way, she would say. Might take longer, might be harder, might not feel good in the moment, but there's always another way. You gotta find it before you do something you can't take back. As she aged, the life she had chosen began to weigh heavily on her body. By her 50s, years of wading through cold marsh waters had left her joints swollen and stiff, her vision dimming in the swamp's low light. Hunting and foraging became harder. For the first time since she was 12, Evelyn faced the question of how she would survive when she could no longer care for herself. The answer came in 1893, when a hurricane tore across the South Carolina coast, flattening islands, drowning wildlife, and destroying much of the fragile world she had built. Injured and weakened 66-year-old Evelyn finally accepted help from former Maroons who had long urged her to leave the wilderness. They brought her to a small settlement outside Charleston, a community built by freedmen who had pooled their resources to buy land and homes. The adjustment was difficult. After half a century alone, the closeness of village life felt suffocating at first. But the people there respected her silence, fed her, sheltered her, and gave her the space she needed. She tended a modest garden, shared her knowledge of plants and remedies, and lived quietly, no longer hunted, no longer hiding. She never broke her silence about the fire, not even when journalists offered money or when academics came knocking. Only a handful of people knew the full truth, and they guarded it with loyalty. Evelyn Carter died in 1920 at the age of 75, slipping away in her sleep. Her funeral drew dozens from the community people she had guided, healed, or sheltered, most unaware of the full story of the woman they buried. To some, she had been a helper, to others, a legend. But to history, she remained a shadow, a child of fire who grew into a woman of refuge, remembered less for the vengeance she once wrought than for the quiet redemption she pursued until her final breath. Evelyn Carter was laid to rest beneath a plain wooden cross in the community cemetery, her grave marked only with her name and the years she lived. But her story did not end there. The legend of the girl who set fire to the Whitfield mansion lived on, carried through generations of African-American families as both warning and inspiration. For some, her tale underscored the tragedy of children caught in violence. For others, it was proof of the extraordinary courage required to strike back at an unjust system, no matter the cost. By the 1960s, in the midst of the civil rights movement, Evelyn's name resurfaced. Activists and scholars looked to her life for parallels to their own struggle. Some framed her as an early symbol of armed resistance to white supremacy, while others pointed to her story as a haunting example of how oppression could warp the minds and lives of even the youngest victims. Debate over her legacy has never truly ended. Was Evelyn Carter a freedom fighter who seized the only weapon she had, or a broken child who lashed out in unforgivable rage? The answer depends as much on the lens of the beholder as on the facts themselves. What cannot be denied is the mark she left on Charleston and on American history. The Whitfield fire became a symbol of the fragile peace that hung over plantation life, proof that a system built on bondage could never be fully secure while those it enslaved carried silent, burning hatred. Today, the site where the mansion once stood is nothing more than a quiet park. No plaque recalls the fire of 1839, no marker names the girl who set it. Charleston, like much of the South, has chosen to soften its past. Yet among certain families, in whispered stories and half-remembered songs, Evelyn's memory survives. Historians who study her life see in her story the themes that defined slavery and resistance. She was a child crushed by dehumanization, driven to an act of violence that scarred her forever. She carried her guilt like a weight, yet later sought redemption by guiding fugitives to freedom, proving that even someone who had committed terrible acts could still grow, still change, still bring good into the world. Evelyn's life, then, is not simply a tale of vengeance. It is a meditation on justice, mercy, and the fragile line between heroism and tragedy. The marshes that sheltered her have changed beyond recognition, drained and reshaped by industry and development. The maroon communities that once offered refuge have long since vanished. But even now, guides who lead tours through the surviving wetlands sometimes tell of a ghostly figure glimpsed at dawn, a barefoot girl moving through the mist, forever searching for something she lost long ago. Whether truth or folklore, the story endures because it speaks to something deeper, the unresolved questions of violence, justice, and survival in the face of oppression. Evelyn Carter left no diaries, no interviews, no written record of her own thoughts. She carried her truths with her to the grave. What we know is this: a 12-year-old girl battered by cruelty and stripped of her childhood made a choice that changed her life and became legend. She spent the rest of her days trying to live with that choice, finding redemption not in forgetting, but in helping others find the freedom she had seized for herself. More than 150 years later, her story still lingers, a reminder of the human cost of slavery and of the way pain and resilience can shape a life into both warning and inspiration. The irony of Evelyn Carter's life was that in the end, the deaths of 3 children accomplished nothing lasting. The system she had struck at white supremacy did not fall with the Whitfield mansion. It endured the Civil War, adapted to emancipation, and reasserted itself in new forms of oppression. That knowledge haunted her. The children's lives had been lost to her rage, and the world had carried on unchanged. Yet instead of collapsing under the weight of despair, Evelyn transformed that truth into a commitment to redemption. She gave her skills to others, offering fugitives shelter and guidance, making herself into a protector rather than an avenger. Over time, she became known as someone who could be trusted completely, someone who would never betray another soul. The legend of Evelyn Carter never died with her. It grew shifting with each generation that retold it. Among some African American families, her story became a cautionary tale about how rage, even justified, could destroy the innocent. For others, she was remembered as proof that even the most powerless could strike back at a system designed to crush them. By the 1960s, civil rights activists rediscovered her name. Some saw her as an early symbol of armed resistance, others as evidence of the psychological wounds inflicted by oppression. The debate continues to this day. Was she a freedom fighter or a traumatized child who acted in unforgivable violence? The truth lies somewhere in between, in the complexity of a human life shaped by unbearable circumstances. What is certain is that her actions shook Charleston to its core. The fire of 1839 terrified the city's white elite not only for the lives lost, but for what it revealed, that their wealth and comfort rested on the simmering resentment of those they enslaved. For generations, they had told themselves that enslaved people were content childlike, dependent on their master's care. Evelyn shattered that lie. She was only 12 years old, and she had deliberately destroyed an entire family. The ripple effects were immediate. Insurance companies began requiring plantations to increase security, forcing owners to reinforce their homes with iron bars and to sleep with loaded pistols close at hand. Elegant houses became fortresses, their beauty scarred by fear. Families who had trusted enslaved domestics to move freely through their homes now imposed harsh restrictions, limiting their access and watching them constantly. Some households abandoned the use of black house servants, entirely hiring poor whites instead at greater cost. Others fled Charleston altogether, unsettled by the thought that what had happened at the Whitfields might happen again. Within the enslaved community, the impact was tangled. Many were horrified by the killing of children, unable to condone Evelyn's act, even as they longed for the downfall of slavery itself. Yet at the same time, whispers of her defiance spread. Her story became a reminder that even a child could resist, that the system was not unbreakable, that the rage smoldering in the enslaved heart could ignite at any time. Evelyn Carter's life remained suspended between tragedy and defiance, cruelty and courage. She was not a saint nor merely a monster, but a human being caught in an impossible world. Her story reminds us that oppression twists everyone. It touches its victims and its perpetrators alike, leaving scars that echo across generations. Yet it also shows that choice, even in the darkest circumstances, remains a powerful assertion of humanity. The fire that consumed the Whitfield mansion is long gone, but the questions it raised about justice, vengeance, and freedom's price still burn, challenging us to confront the unfinished work of history. The murder of Margaret Robert and little William Whitfield was a line that even many enslaved people who longed for rebellion could not bring themselves to cross. In the slave quarters of the Low Country, Evelyn Carter's actions sparked heated debates. Was she a monster who had slaughtered children, or a desperate girl who had struck at the only target she could reach? To some, she embodied terror. To others, she represented proof that resistance, even at the cost of blood, was possible. Her escape only deepened the argument. No matter how people judged her methods, the fact remained that a 12-year-old enslaved girl had destroyed one of Charleston's most prominent families and then vanished into the swamps without a trace. Despite the deployment of patrols, dogs, and reward bids, she remained free. This gave hope to others who dreamed of escape, and in the years that followed, there was a noticeable uptick in runaways across the South Carolina coast. Authorities responded with characteristic severity. Patrols were expanded. Punishments for fugitives grew harsher. Laws restricting slave movement curfews and assembly tightened the already suffocating grip of the plantation regime. Plantation owners sought out professional slave catchers, many of them former hunters or militiamen, who began advertising themselves as experts in coastal pursuit. They unleashed bloodhounds trained to follow human scent through mud and reed beds, and they developed new methods of sweeping the marshes where Evelyn had disappeared. But Evelyn was always ahead. Her intimate knowledge of the tidal marshes gave her advantages no outsider could match. She learned how to wade in the shifting currents, so her scent vanished, how to guide herself by the moon and tide when landmarks failed, how to slip into hiding places so deep and uncomfortable that no searcher would imagine anyone could endure them. More uncanny still was her sense of timing again and again. She seemed to anticipate her hunters' movements, vanishing hours before they closed in. This game of hunter and hunted became part of her legend. Stories spread of searchers stumbling upon her abandoned campfires, still warm, or of dogs brought to the water's edge that whined and refused to go further. Some swore they saw her silhouette drifting through the fog, only for it to dissolve into nothing when they approached. Myths grew around her, painting her not as a girl, but as something otherworldly, a spirit of the swamps itself. Her continued freedom was an expensive humiliation for those who sought her capture. Rewards climbed to staggering sums enough to buy multiple strong field hands. Insurance companies that had paid out on the Whitfield estate put money toward her capture, eager both to recoup losses and to send a message. But as months became years and years turned into decades, the chase lost its urgency. Evelyn Carter had become less a fugitive than a phantom, a reminder that the system was never as secure as it pretended to be. By the 1840s and 1850s, her story had been absorbed into the great national argument over slavery. Abolitionists in the North held her up as proof of slavery's violence, pointing to her as a child driven to desperate extremes by an inhuman institution. They softened the details of the Whitfield fire, framing her not as a killer, but as a symbol of the unnatural pressure slavery inflicted. Southern defenders of slavery, meanwhile, used her to stoke fear. They described her as a savage proof that enslaved people were inherently dangerous when not under strict control. They cited her crime to justify ever harsher rules, more chains, more whips. In the end, both sides used Evelyn as a weapon in their broader struggle, reducing her to either symbol of savagery or symbol of resistance. Few stopped to wrestle with the reality of her life, a 12-year-old girl brutalized into a decision that blurred the line between justice and atrocity, survival and vengeance. Her humanity and the torment that followed her was lost in the noise of politics. And that perhaps was the greatest tragedy of all. Evelyn's story, once rooted in the specific soil of Charleston's marshes, began to grow far beyond its origins. Stripped of its painful complexity and repackaged as a morality tale, it circulated in forms both distorted and enduring. The California gold rush carried her legend westward, where miners and drifters, men and women already living outside society's boundaries, found something magnetic in the tale of a child who defied her masters and disappeared into the swamps. In the mining camps and boomtowns, dime novels and penny newspapers reshaped her into whatever figure audiences desired. Some cast her as a femme fatale, a beautiful woman, using seduction as her weapon against oppressors. Others transformed her into a general leading armies of fugitives into glorious battles against plantation militias. None of these stories bore much resemblance to the truth, yet all testified to the enduring power of her legend. By the time the Civil War loomed, Evelyn's name was already larger than life. Union military planners knew that thousands of Maroons and fugitives were scattered through the South, and they looked to them as both manpower and symbols of liberation. When word reached Union officials that the girl who had burned the Whitfield mansion still lived in the coastal swamps, their interest was immediate. Recruiters imagined her as both a scout and a rallying cry, a living symbol to inspire others to take up the Union cause. But Evelyn had no faith left in organized authority. Both abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates had already twisted her story to serve their own ends, and she had no intention of letting Union officers do the same. Her refusal to step into their service frustrated military strategists. But she remained consistent with the lessons she had learned. Trust no master, however benevolent they claimed to be. Instead, she found her own way to serve. Using her unmatched knowledge of tides, marshes, and hidden trails, she became a conductor of extraordinary effectiveness on the Underground Railroad. She guided small groups and families through terrain so inhospitable Confederate patrols dared not follow. Her success rate was astonishing, and though her work lacked the spectacle of leading troops into battle, it freed lives, hundreds of them, one crossing at a time. The work, however, carried a heavy emotional toll. Helping parents carry terrified children through waist-deep water, whispering reassurances in the dark, stirred memories of the Whitfield fire she could never escape. One rescue in particular nearly broke her resolve. A woman named Martha fled with her 3 sons after learning they were to be sold separately. The youngest boy, barely 4 years old, looked so much like little William Whitfield that Evelyn's breath caught the first time she lifted him into her arms. Over 3 grueling days to the Union lines, she cared for him, soothed his fear, and carried him when his legs gave out. His blind trust in her, a child's simple faith, reopened wounds she thought had long scarred over. When they finally reached safety, and the boy wrapped his tiny arms around her neck in gratitude, Evelyn was forced to reckon with the impossible paradox of her life. She was both destroyer and protector, both the girl who had ended children's lives and the woman who now saved them. It was a reminder that she could never outrun her past, but also proof that her future was still hers to shape. In every step through the swamp, she chose redemption, even if the fire of 1839 would always burn behind her. The trust of that small boy, his willingness to follow her through swamps and darkness on nothing more than his mother's word, forced Evelyn to reckon with the enormity of what she had taken from the Whitfield children. They too had trusted, believing their parents would keep them safe, and she had betrayed that most basic faith. But guiding Martha's sons safely to Union lines also showed how far she had come. The same instincts and skills that had once destroyed were now being used to protect, to reunite, to heal. It was not redemption in full, for nothing could erase the screams that haunted her nights, but it was a beginning. A fragile proof that her life could still carry meaning beyond vengeance. With the war's end and slavery abolished, Evelyn's role shifted again. Many of the people she had helped escape yearned to return to South Carolina to search for family, and they turned to her for guidance. These reverse journeys often proved even more dangerous than flight to the Union lines. The countryside teemed with Confederate deserters, disbanded militias, and embittered former masters who resisted the new order with violence. Evelyn became both guide and guardian, drawing on her mastery of the land to lead freedmen through hostile terrain. She devised new routes to skirt known trouble spots, established hidden supply caches, and used her instincts to steer groups away from danger. Her work soon intersected with the Freedmen's Bureau, when federal agents attempting to manage Reconstruction. They marveled at her story and pressed her for interviews to send back to Washington, hoping to frame her life as a parable of redemption. But Evelyn resisted. She understood too well how her story could be twisted to serve others' agendas. The same legend that made her valuable also made her vulnerable, and she refused to let officials pin her down or make her a symbol in someone else's report. Those who respected her boundaries worked quietly with her, slipping her supplies and information that strengthened her networks. Others persisted in trying to bring her into the spotlight, arguing that her voice could inspire countless others. Evelyn's reply was always the same. She would rather help one family in secret than be paraded before an audience she did not trust. This pragmatic approach, personal over political survival over spectacle, sometimes drew sharp criticism. Some activists accused her of cowardice, of shirking responsibility for the moral and political weight of her past. Others claimed her isolation only reinforced the secrecy and silence that had long sustained slavery. Evelyn did not dismiss these arguments. At times she wondered herself if she was hiding behind the marshes rather than confronting the larger fight. But she also knew she could not be what others wanted her to be. She had been broken too young, scarred too deeply to stand on stages or deliver speeches. What she could do, what only she could do, was guide the lost and hunted through the marshlands she had mastered. As the South hardened into Jim Crow in the late 19th century, her roots found new purpose. African Americans who resisted segregation or who drew the wrath of white mobs often needed to vanish for days or weeks. Evelyn's pathways, forged in slavery, adapted seamlessly to this new oppression. She offered temporary refuge, safe passage, and the kind of invisibility that only the swamp could provide. Though older and slower, she remained a shadow in the reeds, a keeper of hidden roads that served not only fugitives from bondage, but also those fleeing the evolving machinery of racial terror. In this, Evelyn Carter became something rare, a living bridge between the old world of slavery and the new world of segregation, carrying forward her burden of guilt while turning her hard-won survival into protection for others. She never embraced the title of activist, but her quiet defiance in the marshes kept alive the possibility of resistance in a landscape that had crushed so many. Evelyn Carter's later years revealed a woman who had not only survived history, but had also shaped it in ways that blurred the line between fact and folklore. By then she had become not just a guide for the oppressed, but a bridge between worlds, working at times even with white allies who risked their own lives for justice. One of the most striking of these collaborations came when a Charleston newspaper editor, threatened for denouncing lynching and racial violence, was forced to flee the city. Evelyn guided him safely through treacherous ground, just as she had done for so many fugitives before. In his writings, he never revealed her name, only describing her as an angel of the marshes who appeared out of the mist to save him and disappeared just as suddenly once he was safe. Stories like this renewed and reshaped the legend of Evelyn Carter. To some, she was no longer just the runaway child who had burned the Whitfield mansion, but a spirit of justice who moved unseen through dangerous times, intervening when the balance tipped too far toward cruelty. Her myth grew, adapting with the changing South, but always anchored in mystery, power, and moral ambiguity. As the decades passed, Evelyn herself began to reflect on her legacy. She knew that nothing she did could erase the fire of 1839 or the deaths of 3 children. But she also knew she had spent more than half a century turning survival into service, saving lives, reuniting families, offering protection where none could be found. Whether that balanced the scales was a question no one could answer, but it gave her peace to believe she had done what she could with the years she was given. Old age brought new challenges. The marshes that had once been her fortress now wore her body down. Her eyesight dimmed, her joints ached, and her independence waned. For someone who had built her identity on self-reliance, learning to accept help was painfully difficult. Yet the help came willingly. Former fugitives returned with supplies, money, and gratitude. Younger activists took on the physical work of leading escapes, relying on Evelyn's accumulated knowledge to guide them. She transitioned from scout to strategist, passing on what she had learned so others could carry her work forward. That network of care and loyalty was perhaps the truest testament to her life. Dozens of people who owed their safety to her efforts, many of them never even knowing her full story, considered it their duty to ensure her comfort. By the time Evelyn entered her final years, she was no longer alone in the wilderness. She was surrounded quietly but faithfully by a community bound together by the risks she had once taken for them. Evelyn Carter's story remains one of the most complex and haunting in the history of American slavery and its aftermath. Her act of rage in 1839 cannot be separated from the brutality of the system that produced it, nor from the long years of service and sacrifice that followed. She defies easy moral labels. She was both destroyer and protector, child of trauma and agent of redemption. Her life forces us to confront the hardest questions about resistance. When does defiance cross into atrocity? Can redemption ever outweigh bloodshed? How does trauma shape the choices of those who endure it? Even now, her legacy resonates. In debates about justice and violence, about how societies should remember their most painful pasts, Evelyn Carter's story continues to surface as both a warning and a lesson. She reminds us that history is lived by human beings, flawed, scarred, capable of both terrible and extraordinary things. And she reminds us that even in the darkest moments, the act of choosing whether to destroy or to protect remains a profound assertion of humanity. In that sense, the 12-year-old girl who walked into the Charleston marshes on a summer night in 1839 never truly disappeared. Her choices, her contradictions, and her search for redemption ripple forward, still challenging us to look unflinchingly at both the horrors and the hopes that shape our shared history.